The fate of Russian Navy's flagship for its Black Sea fleet, that is Moskva, now we all well know. Even the Russian Ministry of Defense, everybody, the government has acknowledged that the ship has sunk. The debate remains, however, over what sunk it. Russians would like you to believe that this was a fire that accidentally happened in the ship's ammunition storage area that led the ship to catch fire, and most of their crews were then able to escape and they abandoned ship. On the other hand, the Ukrainians claim that the ship was brought down or sunk by two of their Neptune missiles. You can see the pictures. Increasingly now, all the sources, not just the Western official sources, that is US and Europe, but also other evidence that coming from people from open source intelligence areas, etc., are also indicating that this was actually a result of a missile strike. So two really cheap missiles with less than 200 miles, just about 280 kilometers, in fact less than 300 kilometers of range, have taken down a ship of this size. How big the ship is? It is about 12,500 tons. Now, how do I put that in perspective? That's like it is the third heaviest category of ships in Russian Navy. Now, Russian Navy is not given to having very large ships, not like the American Navy, but they have a lot. Third heaviest for them in their category is a very important ship. Plus, as I said, it's a flagship. It usually has a complement of 510. It was believed or rumored, or is generally believed, that when the ship was struck, it had about 550 people, and possibly a lot of them have escaped or they have been rescued. We don't know. That we'll figure out in the course of time. It also seems, now again there are two views. One view is that the Ukrainians use a Bayraktar, a Turkish Bayraktar drone. It's only recently that Turkish Bayraktar drones also joined the Ukrainian Navy. We know that those are being used by the Ukrainian army, particularly against Russian tanks, Russian anti-aircraft systems, Russian radars, control centers, etc. But Ukrainian Navy has also been using Bayraktar drones. So it does look like there was a Bayraktar drone somewhere there in the vicinity. And when you say the vicinity, it doesn't mean something that you can say with naked eyes or with binoculars. It will be in the vicinity in today's electronic warfare terms. Now, what was it doing there? So one view is that Ukrainians used it essentially to distract the air defenses on Moskva. Now, Moskva has a three-layered defense against incoming missiles, aircraft, medium range, short range, and also what is called as CIWS, that is close-in weapon system. The close-in weapon system, even if a missile gets past the other two, the first two tiers of defense, gets really close to the ship, this close-in weapon system can fire a lot of rounds, 5,000 rounds of explosive ammunition per minute at this target, and basically envelop the ship with flak. So once again, even at the last moment, this missile can be defeated. Now, obviously, this did not happen. This air defense was misled. Either they were complacent or they were misled by this drone, because they might have thought that the attack will come from the drone. The other view is that the drone was not really a distraction. Ukrainians knew what they were doing. They were confident of their missiles hitting the ship. So they had put the Bayraktar there, one, to guide those firing the missiles for targeting. So Bayraktar could track the movements of the Russian ships so that these missiles could find their target more accurately. And second, possibly even collect photographic evidence or camera evidence of what happened to the ship, or what in old-fashioned terms would be called bomb damage assessment, or BDA. So we will see. I think the entire strategic community in the world is waiting. If over the next day or two, after all the clearances and processing, Ukrainians release some of that footage, we don't know. Now, how significant is this loss for Russia? You can again say that, look, Russians have so much superiority and they have so much in reserve that the loss of one ship, even if it's their flagship, is not going to hurt their overall war effort so much. The second thing is, At the same time, on the contrary view is that, look, when you lose your flagship, such a big symbol of Russian power, then it becomes, besides the fact that tactically you lose that advantage, because Russians have been wanting to control Ukraine's coast all this while so that they can make Ukraine a landlocked country. So they've been wanting to capture the big port city of Odessa, for example, the whole action in Mariupol, and then going west from there, Mykolaiv, and going towards Odessa is to capture Odessa. And if that was to happen, then this ship would have played a key role in this. This ship's purpose also in that area was to provide air defense, because it had a lot of air defense missiles, sensors, radars. Its function also was to provide air defense to all the other Russian ships there, and possibly also going ahead as the battle got closer to the coast, to Russian combat aircraft and Russian cruise missiles and other missiles as well. Obviously, all that is now gone. Now, how significant this loss was? So we have to remember that this is the heaviest, the largest ship sunk since the Second World War. Now, before this, the biggest ship sunk was just a little bit lighter than this, just a little bit smaller than this. This is a 182-meter ship. It's a very large ship. That was General Belgrano, which was really a Second World War cruiser with a lot of people on board of Argentinian Navy. That was sunk by a British submarine called HMS Conqueror. So there was some debate after that whether the Royal Navy should have sunk that big cruiser or not, risking so many lives. 323 people lost their lives from that ship. Many others, fortunately, were rescued, both by Argentinian and, if I remember correctly, Chilean navies at that time. Now, this ship is one of a series of 10 of Slava. Slava means glory. Right? Both Ukrainians and the Russians use that word. That's why they say Slava Ukraina. And there's a little story there. So this ship was called Slava-class. 10 ships were to be built. 3 were built, 6 were abandoned, and another one was being built ironically. And that's why I said there is a little irony to Slava Ukraina, which is the slogan of Ukraine, and Slava is also glory in Russian. That one was called Ukraina, and it is still lying semi-built at the Ukrainian dock and port city of Mykolaiv, around which so much fighting is taking place. So this was the Slava-class called Ukraina, because remember, there was a time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. The other 2 ships survived. The other 2 ships are not in this battle. They are not involved in Black Sea. That is Marshal Ustinov and Varyag, one of the 3 biggest missile cruisers of Russian Navy, has now gone down. Now, it also so happens that this is the ship which had sent that warning to a small detachment of Ukrainian soldiers at Snake Island, asking them to surrender. And those soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, had responded by saying, Russian warship, go bleep, 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 bleep yourself, right? Go F you, bleep, bleep yourself. It so happens that just a day before the ship actually got sunk, Ukrainian government had issued a postage stamp, a commemorative postage stamp, which Zelensky released, celebrating the bravery of those soldiers. And you have the silhouette of this ship, Moskva, in the background. In the seas, a Ukrainian soldier, and the words, Russian warship, go F you, bleep K yourself, right? So I don't know whether there is a coincidence to the timing, or whether the Ukrainians had an idea, they had this ship in their sight and within the range. We will never know that in any case. Again, how important this ship was for the Russian Navy and their morale, we can do no better than quote from a Russian Navy publication, Russian military publication. And this is a 2017 article. And I find a quote there in many of the articles that I've read. It says, quote, in the history of modern Russian Navy, there are ships that not only embody the sea, but also power of the state. The flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, this article said in Russian arms, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet is just that ship. So that is the ship, symbol of the Russian power, that has now gone down. Now the loss of the ship is an incident, a big incident, but an incident. And result of big wars are not determined by one incident or a bunch of incidents. Maybe it's a setback for the Russians. But what is the bigger picture? If you see the bigger picture, this war that the Russians are fighting, that a much stronger military power is fighting against a much weaker military power, albeit armed with a lot of smart, modern weapons. But most of these weapons are such that can be carried or fired or used either by individuals or groups of 8 or 10 people, or maybe just a missile launcher somewhere, as the Neptune is. Neptune, by the way, is a missile that the Ukrainians have developed themselves. Ukrainians have a very strong military industrial base. Even the new stealth frigates that India is building, that with Russia's help, the engines for those are coming from Ukraine. And because Russia has not been buying from Ukraine, India has been buying them from Ukraine and then shipping them to the dockyard in Russia where those are being built. One is being built in Goa also, in India. So Ukrainians know their stuff. So in 2014, when the Russians took over Crimea almost without any resistance, actually without any resistance at that point, they also confiscated whatever was left, whatever was there. They also confiscated whatever existed of the tiny Ukrainian navy, because they were all on the port of Sevastopol. So Russians took the port in Crimea and took those ships also and took them away to Russia. So Ukraine has had no navy. Ukraine at this point has no navy, and yet they have sunk the flagship of the mighty Russian navy. What this tells us is that the nature of warfare is now changing. And I would recommend to you to see something. This is a Twitter handle, and we've quoted from Oryx, an open source intelligence site, earlier also while we were talking about the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I will share a link of that episode of Cut the Clutter 618, I think, with you, to see how these new elements are changing the nature of the battlefield and the nature of warfare going ahead. And any army which remains conservative, armies tend to be conservative. Any army which remains conservative and any army which still remains obsessed with size might meet some nasty surprises going ahead. So if you go to this Twitter handle, I don't know how to pronounce it, I will try, but I will spell it out for you. Oryx Spionkop, that is ORYX SPIONEKOP. I will share a screenshot also with you. What they do is, all the losses from both sides, Ukraine as well as Russia, they count those losses, only the ones that they can confirm. And they confirm them photographically, either through a picture or through a video. And when you see this data on their website, and they say this T-72 tank lost, 5 T-72 tanks lost by Russia or by Ukraine. And if you touch it with your finger, you can see the photographic or video evidence of a wreckage or a captured tank, etc., etc. So this is authenticated to that level. Now, if you see that, you now see clear evidence that Russians have lost 507 tanks. It's a lot of tanks to lose. 507 that they can confirm with photographic evidence, which means real losses must be much more than that. So 507, out of which 257 are destroyed, 40 are abandoned, 9 are damaged, and Ukrainians have captured 201 intact. What kind of Ukrainian losses have been documented or established by looking at these pictures, or for which these open source intelligence experts can find pictures? 112 Ukrainian tank losses, 44 destroyed, 1 abandoned, 9 damaged, and 58 captured by the Russians. So if Ukraine has lost 112 tanks in the war so far, they've also captured 201. So in a way, they have not only filled up their losses, but have even collected 100% increment or add-on or over their losses. If you look at this now, how has this happened? How can a small army be doing so much better than a much bigger army. So read this article in the New York Times by Tom Friedman. I'm sharing a link with you. Please do check it out. Tom Friedman quotes a very famous and well-known American strategic affairs, military affairs expert who's written a landmark book. The expert's name is John Archila. He's a very well-acknowledged expert. You can check out a lot of his writings. He also wrote a landmark book titled Blitzkrieg, The New Challenges of Warfare. Now, he says to Tom Friedman that there are 3 new rules of warfare which Ukrainians have absorbed and which the Russians have not catered for. So one is small can defeat big, which means in this case what we are seeing is bands of 8 or 10 Ukrainians with some smart weapons, with some manpads, either to take down aircraft or helicopters. In fact, they've been taking down attack helicopters, Russian attack helicopters, even with anti-tank missiles, because those helicopters come quite low to find their targets. Also anti-tank missiles and other such weaponry. So these bands of 8 or 10 people are able to fight much bigger armies. That is the first rule of modern warfare. Just because you have a big, huge army and the other side doesn't have one, it doesn't mean that you will just have a cakewalk. That's what the Russians thought initially. When they sent all these tanks and armored columns towards Kiev, etc., they thought just the shock and awe effect of this, along with long-range missile attacks over Kiev and other cities, will be so crippling to Ukrainian morale that they will just fold over and give in. In fact, that's when even I had written in a national interest that by the time you read this, maybe Kiev would have fallen. But that did not happen because Ukrainians had understood that they could let the Russians come in, and because they had these instruments, they could spot the Russians and they could destroy enough of them to have a deterring influence. So that is the first rule. The second rule is finding beats flanking. What does that mean? When you have a strike corps, because in the Indian-Pakistan context we talk about strike corps. Strike corps, 3 divisions of forces, maybe 500 tanks rolling down the plains, right? And the other side has to come and fight. So people in the old-fashioned thinking or in the traditional thinking, not necessarily old-fashioned, because if large bodies of tanks, large bodies of armored and mechanized forces side, so the same thing will happen, because then you will have maneuver and flanking, which means you can get around somebody. If you're attacking, you can get around the defenses. That's flanking. In this case, it's finding. If you have these small bands of people with weapons which at a distance can destroy much bigger and heavier targets, right? Much more formidable targets, then finding becomes crucial. And finding in Ukraine's case is not just being done by NATO resources for intelligence, electronic intelligence, satellites, but it's also being done by all the civilians. So once again, the civilians there, even old grandmas, children, teenagers, everybody is becoming a participant in the war. Anybody with a mobile phone, any Ukrainian with a mobile phone is able to inform somebody back that this Russian unit or this many Russian tanks or this many Russian soldiers or a missile system are to be seen here or are moving here. And that's the reason they are getting a very high kill rate against the Russians. And number three is swarming is better than surging. So what is swarming and what is surging? Surging, first of all, is when you send 500 tanks. When you send this 40-mile convoy of armored vehicles, tanks, trucks with soldiers inside them going towards Kiev. That is surging. So you think that if the other side also sends the best of its forces or the bulk of its forces, then in the shootout that takes place, I will prevail because there are many more of us. I have a lot more firepower. I will prevail. But what if the other side doesn't do it? The other side, on the other hand, figures out what are your weak points or what are your critical points and swarms those areas. For example, if the other side knocks out the first tank in your convoy and the last tank in your convoy, what that means on a highway is when the countryside is muddied, that your vehicles do not have the luxury of maneuver. They cannot move. So either they become sitting ducks or people sitting in them constantly believe, oh God, I'm a sitting duck. Something will come for me, a missile will come for me. And that's when they start abandoning their vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, no matter how thick the armor on them. So these are three areas in which the Ukrainians have done a lot better, and that's the reason they are still in the battle, now almost into the 8th week. So going ahead, we know that Ukrainians are now getting many more of these switchblade, kamikaze drones with explosives that can go and drop themselves on a tank or a target which is worth destroying. And if they don't find a target, they can come back. So the Americans are giving Ukraine a lot of these. Americans are also giving Ukraine some long-range artillery. And that's very significant because with that, Americans are giving Ukraine some very effective artillery finding radars. What that means is when the other side starts firing at you, you can figure out where this fire is coming from and almost immediately direct counter battery fire at them. That deters the other side from firing. And I see this interview that Jake Tapper on CNN has with retired Major General Paul Eaton, who says, listen, Russian army is a very artillery heavy army. It's a very artillery dependent army. They believe in carrying out a lot of bombardment from way behind where the enemy can't counter it and softening you, pulverizing you to such an extent that when their mobile elements come in, you have no will left to fight. And this new equipment that Ukraine is now being given will be effective or can be effective in deterring that artillery. Now, if that happens, that will again be following the 3 John Aquila rules of modern warfare.